Well, in the other lectures that we've had, we've actually been looking at the woman question, so as to speak. This is what I'm really trying to do with these series of lectures, sort of explore all different aspects of Impressionism. In the second one, we looked at landscape and pigments and technique, and I want to thank you very much for doing research for me. This is what I find so interesting in these lectures, is that people really get very interested and go home and look things up, you know, the details and things that I don't know, and it's very valuable. So thank you very much for that work on titanium white. What I want to do today is to go back then to the concept of modernity, which we looked at in the first lecture under the impetus of Manet. Now remember, modernity was this idea of change, this idea of transience, and the idea of being the painters of modern life. You know, this new art was to have new subject matter. It was about a new vision of society. Well, what I want to look at today is what two artists of this time did with this concept of modernity. And the two people that we're going to be looking at will be Toulouse Lautrec and Renoir. And I want to contrast their approach to the city and to modernity, and in particular to two very important aspects of 19th century society. One which was the gigantic bloodshed or bloodbath of 1871, and the second aspect is the question of women's place in society, which we didn't explore very much in relation to the two ladies who worked with the Impressionists, because I was so busy trying to tell you that you shouldn't actually be looking at them as women. So nothing like a bit of contradiction. All right, so the interesting thing with these two artists is, of course, that they're considered as quintessentially Impressionists, where, of course, Toulouse-Lautrec, who was born in 1864, in other words, he was only 10 years old at the time of the first Impressionist exhibition, never exhibited with the Impressionists. However, he came under the influence of Degas in particular, and was under the influence of the things that influenced the Impressionists, in particular Japanese prints. You can't underestimate how much effect this had on all of these artists. People also think of Renoir, of course. When you think of Impressionism, probably the first thing that flashes into your mind is the Moulin de la Galette, or a canvas by Renoir. Renoir worked with the Impressionists for a very short period of his life. He quite rapidly turned back towards the salon, and in the 1880s begins a completely distinct part of his career, where he becomes portraitist to the bourgeoisie, which is in many ways almost exactly the opposite of what the Impressionists were trying to do, and by the end of his life has become extremely conventional, and really is going back to a kind of classicism, both in his technique and in his subject matter. Now, I've called this purgatory or paradise because there are two extremely different attitudes towards Montmartre at the time. Both of them lived in Montmartre. By the time Toulouse-Lautrec was in his early 20s, he was living a couple of streets away from Renoir, who was living a street away from Degas, and so on. So they were frequenting exactly the same physical location. They had the same models, they had the same mistresses, but you really need to look at the different ways in which they portray them. Now, something which is absent, and this is curiously absent from Impressionism, is, and I wanted to shock you deliberately with this slide. Now, these are the bodies of the Communards of 1871, all right? Twisted, small, working class people, and probably in not exactly papier-mâché coffins, but exposed for view to, as a prevention of other people going down the same revolutionary path. What was the Commune? The Second Empire that we've been talking about in relation to the Salon des Refusés, the Second Empire under Napoleon III, came to an end in 1870 with a massive defeat at Sedan by the Prussians. The Prussians come and besiege Paris. By now, the Third Republic has been voted in as the French government under a historian, well-known historian, Adolphe Thiers. Thiers and the Republican government sign a treaty or an armistice with the Prussians. There is an absolute uproar amongst the Parisians, and in particular the people who live around Montmartre. And I'll be talking about the special significance of Montmartre in a moment. And the people from Montmartre set up what is called a commune, which was a sort of a socialist-based sort of government, and reject the peace treaty. Things get so difficult that the Republican government is obliged to move outside Paris and operate from Versailles. So effectively you have a split in France as to what are they going to do about the Prussians. It's almost like something out of Monty Python's Life of Brian. Have you seen that in the sewers while the Romans are sort of watching while, you know, it's not, you know, I shouldn't joke about it, but it really was quite ridiculous. The communards then hold out against the French forces, who eventually invade Paris and get in through the walls, which are unguarded, and in 1871 they fight street by street. Barricades are put up all across. Barricades are across the Place de la Concorde. I mean, around the Hôtel de Ville, every area is barricaded off. And the, of course, the Versailles troops, which are superior, manage finally to get up to Montmartre, where the cannons and everything which the Montmartrois thought were theirs were stationed. The last of the communards are chased through Père Lachaise cemetery, lined up against a wall and shot down. And this is one of the great places whenever there is a socialist government or anything, manifestation or what takes place, people always go to this wall, which is almost like the Wall of Martyrs. Well, to put it mildly, it was a bloodbath. In a week, in what is called La Semaine Sanglante, the Bloody Week, 50,000 Parisians died. 50,000. I mean, the French, you don't hear about it. The French Revolution's nothing in comparison. 7,000 were deported to New Caledonia, I don't know how many to Devil's Island, and this is what happened in the aftermath. It wasn't just that it was this bloody bath, it was neighbours against neighbours, people denouncing people. And here you have the Parisians, amongst whom were women, and this is the real worry for people like Renoir, is that women took part, and here some of the women are actually shooting the communards. Now these people are being lined up against walls and shot down. So it was really quite an appalling time. Do we have any, 5 years, 4 years later, 5 years later when this is exhibited, do we have any idea that something as divisive as this has gone on? What does Renoir paint 300, well not even 300 metres, 200 metres down the road, right? Which is the Moulin de la Galette, right? Just down the road from where all of this took place in Montmartre. We have a sunlit day, dappled sun in the afternoon, where in actual fact the Moulin de la Galette usually worked on a Sunday evening. We have all classes mingling sociably. Here we have the bourgeoisie who would have come up to have a look at these little girls. The fact that these little girls, we know that this one is 14 and this one is probably 15 and a half, probably here to see if they can get a bit of money from Renoir's friends, who are painters and art critics, doesn't come into it at all. They're so happy, they're leaning forward. This idea of this flirtatious, eternal interchange between men and women is what takes over the whole canvas. The colours blend, the shapes blend, it's all out in nature, and one looks as though it's a kind of Arcadian atmosphere. In fact, this was just down the road from this wall where people had been shot, and this, which is now, of course, one of the dominant features of Paris, was being constructed now by the Third Republic, who was extremely conservative and was driven in many ways by a conservative aspect of the church who were devoted to the Sacred Heart. And so the Sacred Heart, which is where perpetual prayer it goes on 24 hours a day, was built with the idea of it being to atone for the sins of the communards. In other words, the sins of those people who had risen up against the government. Now, of course, the official rhetoric with the French government is that this was to atone for the sins of of civil war, but originally it wasn't. Now what do we have? Who is another person who paints the Moulin Rouge, which is also just down the road? He is painting, however, something like 20 years later, but here we see a different reaction to what these stresses in society. We now get a society which is driven headlong into a kind of hedonistic pursuits, sort of sex, drugs and rock and roll. The rock and roll, of course, was the can-can, which was invented, well, developed at this time, this frenetic gymnastic kind of dance. And the drug of choice was, of course, absinthe. All right, now here you get this sense of energy, this sense of mingling, this sense of people living on the edge of existence. So there were two very different aspects. Now, I just wanted to quickly remind you as to why you got this situation happening in 1871. It was due to the reconstruction of Paris under Napoleon III, remember, when he cuts down the inside part of Paris and turns it over to the bourgeoisie and pushes the working class to the outer boulevards. And here we have painters who have represented the disenfranchised clustered in poverty round the edge. All right, so this social division really was what was at the basis of this last bloody uprising of the working class in the 19th century. Another aspect which was extremely important at this time was the question of the place of women. First of all, we have Louise Michel, who was known as the Red Virgin. She was one of the great instigators of the final fight on the hills of Montmartre. She was on the barricades, as indeed many women were. And afterwards, of course, women were blamed, you know, for the violence that took place under the Commune. She was caught and deported to New Caledonia. She's an unusual woman. She was a teacher, and you always got to watch out for these people. And she was deported to New Caledonia instead of being shot, which was very lucky. She actually stood in front of the firing squad and said, you know, fire, you know, kill me unless you're too much of a cowards to kill me. And in the end, they sort of said, yes, we are. We'll deport you. She was deported to New Caledonia. There, she actually is finally freed, and then takes place in stirring up the uprising of the Kanaks against the French. So they bring her back to Paris, and then she starts all over again. So as you can see, people were right. She was a dangerous woman. The other things that were going on at this time was this push for women. The suffragette movement was later in Paris, but it was alive under Hubertine Auclair, who is pushing for the rights of women. So women are beginning to be visible politically and socially. Now, you cannot overemphasize the importance of the woman issue in the Belle Epoque in particular. Remember, we've been talking about Darwinism, this idea of the rise of what's the expression, the survival of the superior and so on, but it also had ended up in a sort of gendering of society. Not just with women, you know, at home and men in public spaces, but all aspects of society were given sort of gender sort of markers. For example, race was gendered. You know, the superior white race was considered the sort of height of masculinity, whereas the primitive races were seen as feminine. All right, they were considered because they couldn't think, their brains were smaller, as women's brains had been shown. So primitives were feminized, the higher races, i.e. the whites, was sort of seen as masculine. Society was also gendered in the sense that the male bourgeois entrepreneur, you know, the idea of courage and spirit, that was very masculine, whereas the crowd, which was the working class, was seen as feminine. Why? Because the crowd is fickle, it changes, it's hysterical. Medicine also had this sense of normality as being masculine and women as being pathological. Women were kleptomaniacs, women were hysterical. They actually would, if you didn't watch out, would lead to the degeneracy of society as a whole. And of course, you're beginning to get the development of knowledge about diseases such as syphilis and so on. So women were something that was almost an obsession with society at the time, the dangerous feminine side of things. It was also always seen as a negative. However, the problem was that this was all right, this masculine ethos in the 1870s, when France really thought that they had a chance to actually fight and win against the Russians, the Prussians and the Germans. However, by the 1880s and 1890s in particular, France realised that they were not going to ever be a great military power again, and began to emphasise their power as a cultural centre, which is really in many ways what is still the case, the way France actually sees itself on the world stage. So what is culture related to? It was more to women, you know, the sort of the arts of women, and also women were needed in the time of the Industrial Revolution and the time of the commercial explosion of the great shops. They were needed to come out of the family home to become consumers. All right, so you get this, but what's going to happen? You know, are they going to succumb to hysteria, kleptomania? The dark side of women was very evident. So this, you're going to get this sort of obsessional representation of women, particularly in the work of the two artists that we're going to look at. Very, very different. Here we have Rose Rouge, who a model for Toulouse Lautrec, skinny looking, you know, someone who's, you know, a fairly vibrant character. And here we have a typical Renoir. Now, Renoir was not alone in fearing that society was coming to an end. You know, the traditional society of France would come to an end if women moved away from their traditional role. Women were seen as embedded in nature, and men were seen as the cultured ones. So it was culture versus nature. Culture relates to energy and intelligence. Nature relates to inertia and sort of biological aspects. And so you will see very much in Renoir's work, which becomes progressively more attuned to this idea of women as nature, this way in which the woman here is totally absorbed in her own sort of bodily function, if you know what I mean. This white woman here is looking away. Here she's doing something to do with her own toilet. She's either doing her shoelaces up. You'll notice that the women often are caressing their own hair. It's sort of a completely internal space. And the shapes around her don't differentiate her very much, right? The shapes here are very much like the shapes of her body, all right? She's always seen in curves, almost like some kind of a flower, something that you really would like to touch. So women for Renoir are confined very much to their biological function, to their physicality, and you're not going to get very much in the way of individual women, all right? Women are sort of a category. And he certainly wasn't interested in intelligent women. I wanted just to sort of, you know, give this as a further example of a woman who figured quite prominently in the lives both of Toulouse-Lautrec and of Renoir, a woman called Suzanne Valadon, who we'll talk about later. I'm going to have an awful lot to get through. Here you see a representation by Toulouse-Lautrec, a woman in a social situation. And also living on the edge of that social situation. She's drunk, she looks despairing, but she's seen in relation to a cafe, you know, this edgy society of the Belle Epoque. Here we have the same woman who's been what I say Renoir. And in many ways this is very, very typical. He shortens the face of all of his women so that they enlarges the eyes so that they end up with that very sort of baby animal look, which people who work in zoology say that this, you know, all baby creatures look like this because the large eyes, the short face and the puffed out cheeks elicit a sort of very positive emotional response. And Renoir, as you will see, even with his portraits, always reduces his women to this, and so you could not get a more different view of the same woman. They lived in Montmartre, and I'll talk about Montmartre in a little bit later. The first person I want to look at, and I'll probably spend considerably more time on him comparing his work with Renoir, is Henri-Marie de Toulouse-Lautrec Montmartre, who has a very short career, as you see, possibly about 37, as opposed to something like 79 of Renoir. This is an early self-portrait, and we have some early photos of what looks as though a promising, delightful, intelligent child. However, here he is in his castle, in his mansion, with his father, who was really quite eccentric and mad. Now, what is important about him, and what you know about Toulouse Lautrec, probably is the fact that he was very short. People say that he was a dwarf. He wasn't a dwarf. He was afflicted by an illness which I think is called pyknodosostosis, which will be another one for you to look up, which is a syndrome, if you would call it that, of the brittleness of the bones. And at the age of 30, he started to grow normally. Then at 13 he broke one leg, and then at 14 he broke another, and his legs didn't ever grow from that time onwards, which meant that his trunk and the rest of his body developed, but his legs didn't. But also with this particular syndrome, it also meant that he had terrible teeth. I think also his lips grew very large, and so he drooled and sort of slobbered. So he was, it was a very unfortunate body for this man to inhabit. Now, the reason he had this particular problem was because of his ancestry, right? Now, he belonged to the Toulouse Lautrec, which was an aristocratic family going back to the Crusades. However, he belonged to a very minor branch of it. People say he belonged to the aristocracy. By the time his father had claimed, the title of count, it was really almost a non-issue. There were so many other counts in this family that he really belonged. He lived on a property which was very large and quite a large home, but he certainly wasn't one of the great aristocrats. However, in 1801, Napoleon had passed a law forbidding that the aristocrats pass on all of their property to the first child, the primogenitor, which meant that aristocratic families, to conserve their land and their goods, intermarried. And what had happened in the Toulouse-Lautrec family is that his mother and father were first cousins, but they each were the progeny of first cousins. So in other words, his grandmothers were sisters. So you had this incredible, like doubling or tripling or 16thing of the genetic pool. And you can actually see here in this family, I think there were three other cousins who had this same genetic problem. This little girl here could never get out of a baby carriage, even though at the age of 12. His favourite cousin, you can see the problems that they've got with their legs. She dies also very young. Now, what this means is that the Toulouse-Lautrec, the family don't actually want to accept it. They, the father is a hunt and shoot and eccentric, absolutely mad as a snake. Spent his life dressing up, trying to catch bats with elastic bands in the tower, They, when they realised that their only child couldn't do anything, they made up this story that he'd broken his legs hunting. And the poor child from then on was sort of taken from one sort of spa to another with these ghastly sort of operations with weights pulled on his legs to try and lengthen them. He went through huge times of pain and suffering, and he was under morphine for a lot of the time, which is very interesting because, of course, he will die eventually of alcohol abuse or alcoholism, probably a kind of a death wish because of the life that he had to live in this very stunted, ludicrous sort of body in many ways, but also possibly a habit which was given to him very early. Now, his mother, he rarely paints pictures of his mother face on, because she also had terrible problems with her eyes. She was cross-eyed. So you notice that she's shown as looking downwards. I mean, he made the best of an awfully difficult life. And he was a very cheerful, positive sort of person who drank to escape in many ways. His mother was racked with guilt by thinking that she, probably because of this marriage, had produced these problems for her child, and was obsessively maternal, accompanied him everywhere. Now, of course, because he couldn't actually go out, he spent hours sitting with the other female members of the family. And it's very interesting to see in his brothel paintings, what he emphasises is this sense of waiting. this sense of nothing, you know, boredom, of time going while women sit round and wait, and also the sense of camaraderie amongst women who are enclosed in a brothel in his paintings, but many ways he would have felt the same sort of atmosphere at his ancestral home. He, as you can see, he wasn't really a midget. He's told he was a midget. He was about 5 foot. Now, when you think that soldiers in the French army only had to be 5'2" to get into the army, it's not excessively small. If you try and think back of your ancestors a couple of generations ago. Now, he looks incredibly small here in comparison to his very, very tall cousin, who probably had something else wrong with him from... But he actually ended up as a doctor, so, and he was a great rake and a drinking companion. So the pair of them were an extraordinary sort of pair. But as you can see, even though he's got the hat on probably to elongate himself, he's not wildly shorter than this is one of the great doctors at the Saint Louis Hospital. All right, so I wanted to sort of dissipate that. He also took to making fun of himself, because that's what most people did. So he also, and he got this you know, this like of dressing up from his father, who was always dressed up in the most... You never knew when the father was going to arrive dressed up as a milkmaid or something. Now, when the parents realised that he probably couldn't pursue an active career, he was given paints and things when he was in bed, and a member of the family who was a friend of the family was the painter Prince Tau, who no one has heard of nowadays, who was a very fashionable society painter. He painted animals and horses in particular, and he, very interestingly, was a deaf mute. And so he felt great sort of empathy for Toulouse-Lautrec. It's really the most extraordinary sort of number of circumstances, and took him under his wing. And when Toulouse-Lautrec actually goes to Paris, he is instrumental in persuading Alphonse, the father, to allow him to go and paint. And this is one of Toulouse-Lautrec's early paintings of his father driving. His father used to get in the coach and drive hell for leather virtually around the property and get out and then go back up the tower. And here you have this this idea of movement already taken from Prince Tau. This is Toulouse-Lautrec at the time when he goes to London, up to Paris. He arrives in Paris with his mother and is allowed to paint in these very sort of bourgeois salons. And the first person he's enrolled with is Léon Bonnat, who produces these extraordinary visions of society ladies, which are really rather beautiful, but I mean simply portraits. Bonnat doesn't have much time for him, closes his studio and advises him to go to another studio, which is the studio of Renoir. And here you see Toulouse-Lautrec with the other pupils listening to or watching the great master paint. Now, Cormon's specialty were these extraordinary sort of prehistoric things. I mean, I just wanted you to see the kind of influences that he had on his art. Now, Toulouse-Lautrec met some very interesting people there. He meets Van Gogh, and this is his first portrait of Van Gogh. And Van Gogh also meets another person, Louis Anquetin, who becomes interested in the same sort of painting as Gauguin. This was called not divisionist, but large things of light or colours with almost like stained glass edgings. And I wanted to compare these two paintings. You can see the influence of Anquetin on Van Gogh. It's this time that Toulouse-Lautrec comes into contact with the work of Degas, who is living nearby, and this really makes him decide that he is going to disappear from academic painting. In the meantime, of course, every night he has dinner with his mother and then sneaks up to Montmartre, and he's already part of this avant-garde bohemian group. Now, what was special about Montmartre? First of all, you have to remember that Montmartre was a separate village outside the walls of Paris until 1860, when it's annexed by Napoleon III. Right? Napoleon III wanted to expand Paris, so he pulled down the walls around the boulevards to build boulevards and annexes Belleville, Villette, and all of these other areas, which were working class villages. If you go to Montmartre now and you go away from the Place du Tertre, where all the painters are and all of the sort of tourists are, you go down the side behind Sacré-Cœur, and it is still very much a little village, as you can see here. now of course extremely expensive, but it hasn't really lost that village atmosphere. And the Montmartrois, right up until the First World War, even the Second World War, considered themselves as separate from Paris. You know, they would say, oh, I'm going down to Paris to do my shopping, or I'm going into Paris to do my shopping. You know, this sense of living apart. Why did the painters go there? Well, first of all, it is on a mountain, Montmartre, which meant that the light was very clear. Secondly, up until the 1860s, people went there because food and drink brought across the walls had to be taxed, which meant that if you went outside the walls, you got drink and everything like that much cheaper. So on a Sunday in particular, which is when you get the Moulin de la Galette really booming, working class people would move outside to these little bars called guinguettes because of the word for a cheap wine, which is un guinguet. So one of the reasons why you get the painters migrating up there is because of the light, the cheap accommodation, and also a very great availability of young working class girls who are prepared to sit as models. So it is around this vibrant area that you're going to get the first cabarets and the first cafés-concerts. We're getting the development of the working class traditions of song. In particular, here you have Aristide Bruant, a character, if ever there was one, and this is the people that Toulouse Lautrec is going to portray. Exaggerated individualism, as opposed to what we'll see with simply categorization of people with Renoir. Toulouse-Lautrec, here you see this is one of the first posters that Toulouse-Lautrec will develop for Aristide Bruant, who asks him to work for him. The influence of Japanese prints, as you can see, with the great blocks of colour, the unusual perspective. But this was a great advertising. Aristide Bruant had his sort of logo in many ways. He used to wear the hat, the scarf and the cape. In fact, by now he's so well known he can turn his back and people still know who he was. Now he was he set up, he bought the Chat Noir, turned it into the Mirliton, had this great act where he would insult people as they came in, had extraordinary people dressed up as waiters from the Middle Ages and so on. But his songs were what people went to hear. He was an aggressive singer. He made up songs in Parisian slang, which were very difficult to understand. In fact, by the end of his life, he had to publish a dictionary that translates so people had access to his songs. But the basis of subject matter of his songs was one of each of these little villages around Paris, which had been willy-nilly pulled into Greater Paris, but still felt they had an autonomy. And here is one of the songs called La Villette. La Villette, which was where the abattoirs were, so very nitty-gritty. I love this. Isn't it funny, song? He wasn't 20 years old. Didn't know his parents. They called him Toto la Riquette à la Villette. And what happens is it's actually being written by his girlfriend, who says, oh, the last time I saw him, he was stripped to the waist with his head under the guillotine, à la Villette, and so on. But all of the songs have this same very easy, I mean, even if I can sing it, it must be easy, da-da-da-da-da-da-da, almost like a hunting dirge. And they were incredibly popular, and the bourgeoisie used to come up and listen to them. Now, this is what the Chat Noir looked at. Unfortunately, it no longer exists. Now, Toulouse-Lautrec frequented the Mirliton and the Chat Noir, became very friendly with Aristide Bruant, who asked him to do some canvases to decorate his new cabaret, which was called the Mirliton. And Toulouse-Lautrec obliges with these paintings of women and calls them after each of the songs. All right, so there's a song like à la Villette, there would have been a painting like that, which isn't available. But you notice that he emphasises, who does he use to emphasise, as the essence of it, a woman, a working class woman, or seen sometimes from the back in this sense of edgy desperation. This is the new, he is painting the modern life pushed to the furthest degree. Here he is at the Mirliton. Now, probably the emblematic, or two of the emblematic places in Montmartre were the Moulin Rouge and the Moulin de la Galette. The moulin, the mills were very important because at the time, about 1860, there were 30 mills on Montmartre. They were used to grind the gypsum taken out of the soil, which was ground up and brought down to build the great buildings in the centre of Paris. Some of them were also used to grind flour. And this is the Moulin Rouge, which has an interesting provenance, but I haven't got time to tell you about that really. Now, at the Moulin Rouge, this is a painting by Toulouse Lautrec of this Bohemian counterculture, and he makes reference to absinthe in most of his paintings, and that's the green, because absinthe was known as the green fairy, so that's why you get a green tinge to his palette, but also the influence of Japanese prints with this strange, almost makes you feel seasick type perspective, with the woman here who is a well-known actress staring out at us. Now, all of these people, these are people who really existed. This is the other thing that's so interesting, you can actually pick them out. This is La Goulou, the great dancer. This is his cousin, remember that great tall fellow who becomes a doctor. This is Jeanne Avril, and this is May Milton. He paints the extraordinary, excessive characters, the great individuals of the time who flouted all of social conventions. Now this is La Goulou with her girlfriend, the cheesy girl, La Môme Fromage. Now what is so disturbing, I know the names are amazing, no one knows what her real name was. She here is this arrogant, in-your-face individual. Now, when you think of the bourgeois ideal of women, corseted in the boudoir, only allowed out when they're accompanied, here you have a woman who earns her living dancing, who's independent, who is not afraid to appear half naked, who invents that very gymnastic game at the time when bourgeois women really, it was thought that, you know, getting up before 9 o'clock would be bad for your health. So not only is that, but she's a lesbian as well, all right? And so you get Toulouse-Lautrec painting people who live right on the far edge of individuality and who have really pushed the boundaries completely, as he felt that he was doing himself. This is La Goulou. She was called the Goulou because it means greedy, and she ended up being so fat she couldn't dance, and this is why she's shown here. Now she, other things she invents, well, doesn't invent, she develops the can-can. The can-can was already developed from a fandango type dance, but she and the others who developed it into this frenetic, high-kicking routine, not wearing any underwear, and of course this was what was so incredibly scandalous and what made her actually become a star, so it's worth thinking of that, isn't it? All right, now this is when she gets too fat to dance, she starts trying to sort of set herself up in a booth at one of the great fairs, and she asked Toulouse-Lautrec to paint 2 canvases for her and to remind people of her glory days. And this is how friendly he was with these people. And so she's shown here as a can-can dancer, which she can no longer do. This is the man she appeared with, Valentine the Boneless. But here, what is interesting are the people around who are looking at her. This is Félix Fénéon. Do you remember the anarchist who was a great friend of Pissarro? So these are politically the people who the friends of Toulouse-Lautrec. Jeanne Avril, another great can-can dancer, also a lesbian. Oscar Wilde, of course, also the outcast from London, and of course also a same-sex person. And these are other characters here, another great sort of avant-garde pianist. So this is the world that he is portraying. Jeanne Avril, I think we've spoken about her. She was the daughter of an Italian count, and a courtesan, had psychiatric disorders, mainly because of ill treatment as a child, was sent to La Salpêtrière, where she began dancing as a kind of therapy. And she was known to sort of be very graceful, quite different from La Goulou, who was, you know, vulgarity incarnate. And she used to go into a kind of trance on the dance floor. And people said she she was like a dynamic lily. And you can sort of see this sinuosity of her that Toulouse Lautrec has managed to get in this wonderful poster. These are the four of them dancing together. This was an innovation, 4 women dancing the can-can together. Now, here's Toulouse Lautrec again, dressing up, as cross-dressing again, as he loved to, in Jeanne Avril's clothes. And here is Jeanne Avril. And here you get the difference between the frenetic can-can dancing and this extremely prim lady, as indeed she was. Her lover was Wordsworth's grandson, hence the name Jeanne Avril, to be in England, April's there, Avril, April. And she used to also frequent a literary circle and so on. So he's given great dignity and elegance to this woman who frequents these extraordinarily hedonistic nightclubs. The other person whom he paints is Yvette Guilbert, who's another great singer in the tradition of Bruant. Sings little ditties in this cute little voice, but they're so rude if you actually listen to them that it's unbelievable. And of course she underlines her prim and properness in a sort of school teachery mode with the black gloves and a slightly outdated dress, and says the most terrible things. And here he has captured, and this is what about Toulouse Lautrec that I want to emphasise, the individual. He captured just that one trait, the gloves, the lines, and the tilt of the face. And the same thing here. Here's a picture, a photo of her at the time, and the way she's portrayed by Toulouse Lautrec. So within a few lines, he's actually managed to capture the essence. Now, she doesn't represent womanhood. She represents not even just a class of singer, that is her. It's the essence of Yvette Guilbert, that cheekiness. Other people who were outrageous, whom he painted, and not many men, you'll notice. These are women. These are women who are going against the ethos of the time. Is Cao Cao. And now Chahut was the word for the French can-can, Chahut, and Cao, chaos. So in other words, she was a chaotic dancer. In fact, she sometimes even danced nude. Here she is. She was rather large, and she became a clown. So you couldn't get anything less like the sort of bourgeois lady if you tried. And this was even a new innovation in the circus, as having a female clown. She, of course, also was interested in women as well. Here she is coming in with her partner. So again, this emphasis on same-sex relationships. And another place which was a hangout for lesbians at the time was the Dead Rat. I mean, the names are just wonderful. And here you have one of the courtesans. In fact, even in Zola's book, in Nana also has a lesbian relationship with another prostitute, and they go to the Dead Rat. And this person here, who's dressed up in a smoking, certainly is a woman. Well, we now get to the Moulin de la Galette. A galette is a kind of a pancake or a flat biscuit, which was served at the Moulin. So it was originally started out as a kind of, not a restaurant, but it was an open air area where people came, particularly on a Sunday, to dance. And it was between two windmills, two of the few remaining windmills by the 1880s. The Prussians had destroyed many of them. So this is Utrillo's, Suzanne Valadon's son, who has painted this. Not what you'd call paradise on earth. This is what it looked like. And I actually wanted to just give you a view of the Moulin de la Galette, painted by other people at the time. It was one of the, well, not the most important, but most people frequented it. It was part of the cabaret culture, not the most important. It has become very well known, mainly because of Renoir's painting. But here you see Van Gogh's take on it. It's, this is very much the countryside at the time. Here it looks a bit dark and foreboding. In fact, the other side of the Moulin de la Galette was where all the rag pickers lived. It was the maquis. It was a dangerous area. Here we have Zandomeneghi, who were painted at the same time with people going in. It doesn't look extraordinary. And here we have a woman later, this is in the 1890s, sitting looking out at the mill. Nothing much seems to be happening here at all. Well, we now go to Renoir's rendition of the afternoon at the Moulin de la Galette. And as we saw before, it looks the most harmonious of places. All classes, both men and women, people who are intelligentsia, people who work as milliners, all interacting together. People are touching each other. She's got her arm around her. These people are enlaced. You know, these are actually friends of Renoir. People are dancing. It all looks as though you could not find a more wonderful place than Paris on a Sunday afternoon. Exploitation of young women, absolutely not mentioned. The fact is, down the road they're constructing the Sacré-Cœur to make up for the 50,000 dead, not mentioned. Well, I suppose, does art have to mention everything? You know, the little thing on the edge saying, oh, by the way. What is interesting, though, is a painting made by Toulouse Lautrec a few years later, which gives you a very different view of what it was like at the Moulin de la Galette. We still have people dancing, but there's not really much emphasis on this, you know, early flirtatiousness, the joy of, you know, initial male-female encounters. You have people dancing, but it looks a bit sort of crowded, and it looks a bit sort of dark. Also a bit ambiguous. What's this fellow here? Is he actually charging people with, you know, with sedition or something? Because of course this would have been under surveillance at the time because of the anarchists who frequented it. But the other emphasis is boredom, basically. I mean, the people are sitting here, very different from the flirtatious interest of this girl leaning forward, showing herself off. Here we have someone thinking, oh goodness, it must be 8 o'clock by now. Other people, the redheads, important, I'll talk about that later. Not much interaction going on at all. Another painting of, this is the beginning of the quadrille. We have one of the dancers who doesn't look particularly sexy or interesting or young, yes, well, just about to pull up her skirts and start the high kicks. So there's all that sort of sexuality is sort of absent from this. It's really a place which is crowded, and that's it. And this is very much like the Japanese prints you'll see as well, with the large character in the foreground. This is actually a picture, a photo of Toulouse-Lautrec at the Moulin de la Galette, and they were with La Goulou and one of the other dancers. The trees, which look so wonderful in Renoir's painting, were little spindly acacias. Now, a person who will link Renoir with Toulouse-Lautrec is a woman who will become an artist and who is now being looked at seriously as a very interesting artist in her own right, is Suzanne Valadon. Like most of the young girls who were models or who lived on the butte de Montmartre, she was the daughter of a laundress, she was uneducated. Her name was Marie, and it's only when she comes into contact with Toulouse-Lautrec that she will start to call herself Suzanne. Here we see her in her early career as a circus rider. She falls off the horse, as most bareback riders do, and becomes a model. She models for most of the artists that we know, Puvis de Chavannes, for Degas, who will become a great friend and mentor of her and will encourage her art. She models for Renoir and is most likely his mistress, and also becomes the lover of Toulouse-Lautrec. And at one stage it looked as though he was even going to marry her. It didn't come to that, but he was devastated when they broke up. She also broke the heart of a musician, Eric Satie. So she clearly was a very sort of vibrant woman who then turns to painting herself. But here in the early days we have Suzanne Valadon by Renoir. Typical of the male-female interactions that Renoir prefers, the woman sort of coy, turned away, being courted by a much more aggressive male, women literally embraced by men. This is women's place in life. It's certainly not to be out there being independent, making things happen yourself. I wanted just to give you this sort of comparison. This is Suzanne Valadon by Toulouse Lautrec. Again, this sense of a real individual facing the world, facing us and the world, which is not a happy place. Again, in an ambiguous space. But all you get is this sort of sullen expression, as opposed to paintings of Renoir of women in cafes looking extremely cute, always encircled by men. Women's space is one which should be a space protected by men. Again, I just wanted to rub it in a little bit. Here we have again Suzanne Valadon and a painting a little bit later of her by Renoir. Now here you see you could not get a better example of the way in which individuality is erased from Renoir's painting of women. Women are a category, always something which is sexually available. Here she is in this decollete, with the cleavage here. They're always shown basically with very little on the top. Not looking at us, she's simply presenting herself as a body, great physicality, combing her hair, this sort of self-grooming, almost as an invitation for you to groom her hair as well. Very different from this woman who is intensely contemplating her own future. Suzanne Valadon was the mother of Utrillo. I don't know if you know the painter of, and these are her own paintings. I'm running out of time because I've got to get to Renoir at some stage. Rue des Moulins, we get into the great brothel painting series of Toulouse Lautrec. He frequented brothels assiduously. He was sort of, very highly sort of sexed, I suppose. I don't know, but I mean, he had nowhere else to live very much. He actually had a room that was given over to him where he could keep his easels and his paints. And this was a great concession to him because there was a law forbidding men to actually live in brothels at the time. But he obviously frequented them and sort of knew the inmates very well and had great sympathy for them. This idea was that, he was an outcast and they were outcasts of society, so therefore, they had a lot in common. It's more that he had a lot in common with these people who was sort of involved in many ways on the edge of society and who were struggling to survive between two concepts of what it was to be in society at that time. Anyway, this was one of his favourites. All of his women, most prostitutes at the time, had their hair dyed red. Red-headed women were supposed to be the epitome of sensuality. They were supposed to smell different. They were supposed to be sexier, all these sorts of things. And so you'll see that the majority of women, in fact most of Renoir's women, are redheads. Now you get this sense of waiting. I mean, you don't get any of the sense of boredom. There's no sex. There's no fun. It's, oh God, it's only 9:30. I mean, this feeling that he obviously had experienced watching these women. Also, he became very interested in photography, and here he is, a photograph of him with one of his models. And you can actually see there's not tremendous difference in height between them. Again, I haven't time to talk about his interest in photography. He's taken a photo of himself and placed it. So again, this watching the intricacies of the brothels. Now prostitution was a very important topic of the time. In the 19th century, there were prostitutes everywhere, in the boulevards, in the high society salons, right out to the outer boulevards. People came to Paris to see the courtesans. They were in literature, they were in art. You could no longer distinguish if a woman who was walking down the street, was she a courtesan, was she or wasn't she? And there was the great problem, of course, with the spread of syphilis. People had discovered syphilis as a disease. They thought it was hereditary. How are we going to stop this going through the bourgeoisie? Well, couldn't stop men going to brothels, of course. 99% of them did. So you had to control the women themselves. And here you have these women going for their weekly visit. And the sense of, here she is, of course, the bright red hair. The idea of the sort of humiliation these women went through daily, and you very much get that feeling that he has captured, which is very different from the kind of paintings we'll have by Renoir. Also the utter boredom of living in the brothel, and a lot of these paintings here you have the women in the canteen. I mean, this could be sort of, Hawthorne West, Mothers Club, couldn't it? I mean, it really, you have none of the sense of you know, that frisson of it being in a brothel, a high class brothel. They're all just discussing, oh, I don't like the bread much, and so on. Here they are passing time, as they did for hours. What did you do in the morning and the afternoon? Playing cards. But also, a lot of these women in the brothels, and a lot of the courtesans were lesbians, and had turned to it probably because they hated men. I mean, probably having been raped or something at the age of 12 or 13, forced to live in, you know, not slavery, but forced to put up with extraordinary sorts of things, turned to other women for their affection. And here you have this, he captures this very well, this sort of tenderness between these two women embracing. Here they are actually dancing at the Moulin Rouge together. So you're getting this subset of a subset of unusual people whom he portrays. And he portrays a lot of scenes of women embracing in bed. Now, of course, they had to sleep in a bed, because often there weren't enough beds for them. So this is what really ends up happening. Even the posters that he has of the performers, this Mary Belfort was an English performer who used to come in carrying a little cat and used to sort of lisp in terrible French, and for a while that sort of worked because there were all these innuendos about cats and pussies and things, and that sort of was funny for a while. But she wasn't what you call an extraordinary performer, and the headdress looks a bit like the Moulin Rouge, the windmill. And her lesbian friend was another English woman, May Milton. I just wanted to show you probably the first of the great posters. Now, Toulouse Lautrec will be remembered more perhaps for his development of posters, the chromolithography, which will now be put up all throughout Paris, and is what we sort of think of the Belle Epoque, are these posters by Toulouse Lautrec, where he, towards the end of his life, he manages in one sort of stroke to get the dynamism, the edge and the angst of this extraordinary place, the Moulin Rouge. I won't talk to you about that. This is Toulouse Lautrec 2 weeks before he dies. He had been interned for alcoholism, was getting progressively madder, possibly under the influence of syphilis, and finally dies at his mother's property at the age of 36. But having contributed immensely to our understanding of what it was like to live through the Belle Epoque in Paris. The energy, the escapism, the dynamism, and the unusual characters that had been engendered by the turmoil of the 1871 revolution, and people racing towards the millennium. Well, wasn't, you know, the year 1900 was something that they really thought something awful was going to happen. Well, in the meantime, we have sort of Renoir, and I've only got half an hour for him. Now, Renoir was born in Limoges, moved with his father, who was a tailor, to Paris. They were from a poorer family. In fact, his father's business was bankrupted during the Commune. It was destroyed. And Renoir, who's interested in painting, begins his life painting porcelain in different sort of ceramic places around Paris. Now, this means that he early on encounters the 18th century, such as Fragonard and Boucher. Now, these sort of the fête galante, you know, people having fun in nature. In other words, decorative art, right? And this is something which will come out throughout his painting career. Even when he's in his Impressionist stage, his works are appreciated generally more than the other Impressionists because they're prettier. They're more, they have more pattern, they have more colour. And this starts from his early training in line and 18th century imitations. And he was a copier. He also, when that didn't work, he ended up decorating fans, which is why I've actually brought out this particular slide. And he decorated blinds for missionaries. So, I mean, anything, you know, what's the name of that group? Weddings, funerals, anything. All right, so here we have early painting in fact it's not that early, 1879, of a girl. You can see the decorative nature of this. We're not far from what will be taken over by Matisse, where the whole picture plane is brought together. So here we have the flowers, which are one of his great fortes, and in fact he saw women as flowers, right? Women as basically part of nature, a positive part of nature, a pretty part of nature, but similar to flowers. And so here you see her produced as one as well. Now this is one of his typical girls. He loves painting girls up to about the age of 18 or 19. By the time you've got to 19, you're a bit over the hill, right? And even his wife isn't represented very much over about 19 or 20. He actually, when he represents his children, he represents them with a younger nurse, right? He likes people really young. The woman there who was in this particular painting was probably Jeanne Samary, who was an actress of the time. Here in a sort of typical Renoir style, at least she does have some individuality, but she's not seen acting, is she? She's just seen as an elegant woman in this slightly enticing female pose of looking attractive for the viewer. Now, he enters the Fine Arts School and paints at the Glare Academy. Remember Charles Glare, where Monet painted and Bazy as well. Now, Renoir has no money at all, so he ends up sharing a flat with Bazy near the Beaux-Arts. And from Monet influences him amazingly, and it is during this time that he begins to paint in the Impressionist style. Now, Renoir is never someone who is interested in ideas. He's not, if you call an intellectual someone whose life is governed by ideas, he certainly is not that. He's someone who does what he wants. He says, I paint what gives me pleasure. You know, that's what I will continue to do. So for a very short time, he's influenced by the very strong personality of Monet. And as we've spoken about before, he goes outside Paris with him and they paint side by side. Both of them, you know, have no money. But of this is an attractive painting, all right? But he manages to, if you compare that with what was produced by Monet, you find much more in the way of colour. The palette is livelier, and there's more emphasis on figures in a landscape. He's never interested simply in landscape and the idea of the breaking up of light, as was Monet. Here his portrait of Monet, who was influencing him at the time. This is in the 1860s again. Remember, we looked at this with Monet, people going outside Paris to the cabarets. Here you have the interest in the Impressionist period. Now this is the time when he's learning, he's experimenting with light, with the new palette. But even then, if you compare that with the same scene by Monet, of course there is much more emphasis on the people and on the dresses. There are a number of paintings of Paris at this time, again under the influence of the Impressionists, but he now, by 1870s, has become much less interested in streetscapes and in fact will abandon these more or less from this time onwards. Now this is painted at the time of the first exhibition of the Independents, or the Intransigeants as they were called, or as we now call them, the Impressionists. Now I've commented on this particular painting before when we're talking about Morisot, very much as a woman as a decorative object. In 1876, he is now installed at Montmartre, painting this very idyllic types of scenes where you get a family, you know, the subject matter is very much the traditional role of women in the family, protected by a man, in the dappled sunlight. So he's working very much with the Impressionist idea of how light breaks up surfaces. And this is where he will live. We will actually be going up there to the Musée Montmartre, see where that was painted. And then he moves a little bit further, a couple of 100 yards further along, to a place now called the Château des Brouillards, where he spent the rest of his life painting until he actually goes down to the south of France, around about the time of the First World War. Now, in the 1870s, in fact 1876, he's begun to feel that exhibiting with the Impressionists isn't really going to do it for him. He's less interested in the concepts that are being constantly discussed by them. He really wants to sell his canvases, and he persuades Morisot and I think another one, I can't remember which one, to actually set up a public auction of their art. This occurs, not much is sold, but it does work in Renoir's favour because a very wealthy industrialist, he was actually a great publisher, Charpentier, sees his work and buys one, and then commissions him to paint his wife. And it is from this period on that we're going to get a series of portraits of the upper bourgeoisie. These bourgeoisie who want to see themselves as interested in art. Remember, the bourgeoisie wanted to show their respectability, their leisure, their wealth, and these people more interested in the arts would choose Renoir of the Impressionists because he was the most closer, I suppose, to their idea of a pretty picture. And so we get this painting of Madame Charpentier. Now, Madame Charpentier was an important woman who grouped around her a lot of the intelligentsia of the time. She invited people from different walks of life. She saw herself as a bit of like a Marie Antoinette, and we get actually sort of letters of Renoir, all misspelt, I must say, sent to him, rather sort of grovelling letters saying, "Oh, I see you as a sort of the queen of the salon," and so on. Anyway, it is through Madame Charpentier that he will get a number of commissions and start to sell his work. Now, Pissarro, who always generous, sort of says, well, good for him, starvation is awful. And it's from that time on that he will begin to be bought. Now, he then gets the commission of another wealthy banker. So he's really now working, and he's working in the salons of the upper middle classes. So forget about the starving impressionist bit, right? He's beyond this by the 1880s. This is an interesting painting. Renoir didn't like painting men. He much preferred to paint women, and particularly female little girls. Because it was thought also that painting men was more difficult because you had to get in a resemblance, whereas women, even art critics were saying, portraits of women, it's all just cosmetics and frou-frous, whereas men, you've really got to get that likeness. But I think it's very interesting because you have a slightly effeminate man, it appears to me. He's feminine in many ways. In actual fact, he wasn't, he was a tough nut, but he was, like many of these great Jewish banking families, extraordinarily active in the arts. And this man was a great composer, he composed, and Monet has shown his elegance with his cigarette holder and his cravat clasp here, but also quite managed to integrate the wallpaper with his moustache, this kind of slightly witty painting, which is quite effective. Now, he then also went on to paint the daughter of one of the daughters of the Count d'Anvers, as he painted many women. Now, he was much more at home with young girls. Why young girls? Because they're innocent, they're attractive, they're sort of future young beauties, the sense of the tactile nature of their skin and their hair. And this is sort of a portrait of, not a portrait, because you'll notice that it's girl braiding. I mean, this is again this idea of generic references to women, right? You very rarely get someone who's individualized. But if you look back at this portrait, what is it that says that that's Irene Count d'Anvers? Nothing much. It could be this girl. They're very, very similar, always with the same colour hair. Now, I very, very much doubt whether the Count d'Anvers girl was a redhead. She came from a background that was probably Portuguese. Very unlikely that she was a redhead. But this idea of redheads as being the utmost beauty in women, Renoir brings her forward like that. Again, this self-grooming, this sort of inviting, also the emphasis on the sort of pearly, tactile nature of the skin. Women were sort of like fruit, which you could crunch and sort of, well, he actually sort of says, I haven't finished painting a nude until it's so rounded I could pinch it. Oh, right. Okay, here we have another one, Little Girl Gleaning. I mean, that they're very, very similar faces. He also began painting bourgeois interiors. But again, where are the little boys? I've no idea. It's always several girls, and this emphasis on the piano, those of you who came to the series that we had on Desperate Housewives will remember that one of the legitimate outlets for a girl's feelings was the piano. It was called the hashish of women. This idea of women in the right place, in particular young women who are being trained to be brides, you know, and sort of future sort of mothers, kept very much the emphasis on the enclosement. Well, it's almost like a seraglio, you know, the curtain, and then you've got, you know, a kind of couch behind, and this girl's jammed into the piano and into the space here, and they're leaning on top of each other, this sort of very female space. And the same thing here, the innocence. These girls are caught unaware as they sort of innocently read. You know, they know nothing of the world. You know, it's up to men to actually teach them all about this. All that having been said, this is quite an attractive composition. Again, by 1884, he's been given quite a number of commissions to paint the children of families. And here again, we have at least these little girls are doing something, and the little girl playing dolls, very much in a bourgeois interior. Rather wooden, but anyway. I just wanted to show you that by the end of his life in 1910, when asked to do portraits, you see that even his portraits now are virtually reverting to type. This is Madame d'Uberville, whatever she looked like. I'm sure she didn't look anything like this. She has the typical round face, the large mouth, rather undressed for a bourgeois woman, I would have thought, in her afternoon outfit, and the child here is sort of also rather generic. We now get to 1881, where we have one of these emblematic sort of Renoir paintings. Now, if you think of Renoir and you think, oh yes, I like Renoir, there's probably 3 or 4 paintings that you think of, and you don't know of these others. This would be one of the ones that you know. Again, this idyllic scene of male-female encounters, you know, the courting aspect, which is very much like the subjects of Fragonard and the 18th century fête galante, you know, with the courting couples going up to the island of Kythera. Very much like this. This is the island at Chatou outside Paris, and women there know their place. They're to look pretty, you know, as the French would say, you know, sois belle et tais-toi, you know, look good and shut up. And that's basically what you've got here. So you've got a triangle always with a woman, one woman and 2 men. The triangle here, you've got this triangle here with 1 woman and another woman, another triangle here. You have the this is Aline Charigot, who will become his wife, and the emphasis here is on her playing with the little dog. And remember, when we talked about the roles of pets, the importance of pets in bourgeois households, it was to emphasize the sort of futile, cute role that women were supposed to play as well. So that's why we have the dog very much sort of almost in a kissing position with Aline. Also, they're drinking wine, the traditional drink of France, not absinthe, which represents, of course, depravity and the city, which was supposed to be the ruin of women. Here we have a painting of his wife. Now, very few. She was only 17 when she met him, and he was 42. I just let that one pass. And this is one of the few paintings that we have of her. Now, she is presented here as very much a sort of a stock character of fecundity in many ways. She is large, she's doing the most maternal of maternal things, which is breastfeeding, which, by the way, was relatively unusual at the time, but Renoir insisted that his children be breastfed. One wonders why. And here we have this painting then of the domesticity, a woman completely encoded in her biological role. Right? And she's in nature, so woman as nature, men as culture. Aline had a distant cousin, Gabrielle Renoir, who came to live with them when Aline had her second child. And most of the paintings that you know of Renoir with a child will be of this woman, Gabrielle, who stays with them even after the little boy grows up, because she had other services to render. Here we have her with the little boy. Now again, this rose-coloured view of womanhood and and childhood. And this is very much in this Darwinian, sort of social Darwinian idea that women were very much like children. They had small brains. Women were happier with children because they were both sort of undeveloped, sort of physically and mentally. And so there are many paintings of Gabrielle. His wife obviously had to put up with this, here we have Gabrielle with jewellery, Gabrielle with a rose. Again, emphasis on the sort of luscious nature of the skin of the woman. The idea was that you wanted to touch her. She's very much like, her skin and her cheeks are very much like the sort of flowers or the roses here, and the sheen on her breast is very much like the sheen on the material. Here I wanted, as a contrast, to give you a painting by Toulouse Lautrec of a woman. We don't know who it is, it's not a portrait, but the edgy individuality, the character of this woman hits you in the face, whereas here, basically if you put another head on, it wouldn't really make very much difference. There are a few paintings of the Renoir family. By the time Aline was in her 20s, she was considered probably not worth painting with her, breasts uncovered, and so she only appears in this family painting here. Clearly, her washerwoman sort of background is coming to the forth because she's not looking exactly sort of fashionable, and anyway, look, I won't be bitchy about this. Here, of course, in many ways the main character, or the main part of this painting, is Gabrielle with the little boy, and again she's always seen in this role of women servicing the next generation, the maternal, the affectionate, the sweet, the unjudging, and so on. Well, I've just got 5 minutes. I might go 5 minutes over. I want to look at now what preoccupied Renoir for the last period of his life, and that is the development of painting of the nude. Now, first of all, this one here in 1875, a nude in sunlight. Now, remember we were talking about, in the first lecture, we talked about the scandal of Olympia, Manet's Olympia, where people sort of thought her flesh looked as though it was decomposing. Remember, this was the scandal, she wasn't painted properly. And one of the problems about this was that the whole woman question that I've been talking about, the worry about prostitutes and syphilis, and women in many ways being an icon on one hand, but on the underside of it, you've got her as associated with disease and decomposing flesh related to syphilis caught through prostitution. So one of the outcries against this is when flesh wasn't painted as it should be, and they thought it was making reference to diseased flesh. So this was an early painting by Renoir when he's still in his Impressionist period, experimenting with light and so on, and of course it did not receive any critical positive acclaim. But in the 1880s, he goes to Italy, he also goes to Algeria, and he decides he's going to break in many ways with the Impressionists, a lot of the Impressionist ideas, and he wants to go back to the classics, and he will go back and paint nudes. Now, this is the whole thing that the painting of modern art was not about. Remember, the idea was to paint modern life, the edginess of life, the modern developments. It was paint what you see, don't paint from your imagination, and so on. And now we get Renoir using still some Impressionist brushworks and styles and pigments, but going back to nudes, right back, even beyond the Renaissance, back to the sort of really early paintings of nudes. But they're always nudes in his own way. They're nudes who aren't really nude, in the sense that they're always making reference to touching them,
themselves, all right? She's drying herself. She's not a heroic nude. She's not a nude representing a goddess or truth or beauty. She's a very sensual nude. Here we have these very young girls, you will note. It's not just your imagination. They are probably 14, 15. This was the period he liked, 16, 17-year-olds. Women in nature, just having crawled out of the primeval sludge, probably. All right, again, the seated bather, the long hair, you know, caressing her back, the cute face turned away, background, she's in nature. She's definitely not doing anything. She simply is a body. And I thought this really gives you very much this idea. By 1894, again, you get nudes bathing. I don't know how many people bathed nude. People just didn't bathe full stop, you know, in the 19th century. But as for the sort of, you know, nymphs and shepherds cavorting in the sort of sludgy outskirts of the Seine, I don't think so. So these, in many ways, are totally of his imagination. So how far has he gone away from Impressionist technique and subject matter? So he's turning his back on it. He's going back to trying to catch the eternal, all right, which is exactly the opposite of what the painting of modern life was about. Catch the transient, the minute that passes, all right, change. This is going back to the eternal, and what could be more eternal than women? You know, right back to the Garden of Eve. They were there, Garden of Eden, they were there. They were naked in the Garden of Eden, still naked in the Seine. Large bathers, 1887. Again, he's now influenced by Rubens, as you can see. Women here, you can very much see this idea of women, a very large backside and a small head, all right? Intelligence, you know, with social Darwinism wasn't something. And in fact, Renoir makes outrageous statements, most of which I will refrain from saying, but one of which is, you know, fancy going to bed with an intelligent woman. You know, there's nothing worse than that. And also, I paint with a certain part of my anatomy, etc., and so on. This was Suzanne Valadon. I think she was actually quite elderly at that stage, probably 22, but he's managed to make her look like someone who's, you know, having fun, splashing her friend, who's sort of, that's why she's actually got her foot in the air. So Arcadian, women as nature, unindividualized, simply women as the eternal feminine. By 1910, he's sort of getting very much older now, but these paintings are becoming more and more monumental. By now he is actually moved out of Paris and is attempting to live he is living in the south of France and Cagnes-sur-Mer, which isn't Cannes, it's Cagnes, on the Mediterranean coast, where the light is very bright. This will be where many of the painters go to paint, and he will be actually there during the First World War. And in fact, one of his last paintings is Bathers at Cagnes-sur-Mer. As France is being bombarded, he is going further and further back into the past. These paintings, so far as I'm concerned, don't say anything about society, and they certainly haven't moved forward to a new style, a new opening as to what art represents in a society which is falling apart. Toulouse Lautrec's nervous brushstrokes and his development of his posters move art forward. Degas will as well. This going backwards in subject matter and also in style really, I feel, comes to a dead end. And in fact, there is a dead end. He will, no, it's not quite what I thought it was another slide. This is a self-portrait in 1910. He'll die in almost in 1920 at the age of 79. He paints right up to the end. His family are with him. Two of his sons will become quite famous. Jean will become a great director, filmmaker, and Pierre becomes an actor. And right until the end, even though he's crippled with arthritis, he continues to paint. So he's someone and he says at the end, I think I've almost got it. But he what I think he paints best are flowers, and I think they really are very well rendered. But if you actually look at some of those nudes, you see that the way he painted women, as I said, as though they were flowers. Well, while this flower painting and nude painting is continuing on the coast, France is falling into this murderous collective suicide of Europe. The great, very long 19th century dies in the trenches of the First World War. The society that emerges will have to have an art which represents total fragmentation. In fact, you will get surrealism, which will come out of this. Art which will have to deal with the death of God, in many ways, in the Great War. So the two artists we have looked at are then really have taken this idea of modernity in two different directions. Toulouse Lautrec dying very young, but pushing the boundaries in his subject matter and in his style, developing new methods of treating art and society. Renoir playing, or in, well, what's the word that I'm trying to look for, working in the style of the Impressionists, continuing to use some of their techniques, but eventually going back to selling through the bourgeoisie, through the salon, and finally going back to subject matter, which is very far from being able to represent the convulsions of Europe at the time. Thank you.